Hello, Ricochet, and welcome to episode 73 of Radio Free Delingpole, broadcasting to you from occupied Europe. And it is a very dark, depressing occupied Europe at the moment. You may, if you listen carefully, be able to hear the wind howling in the background in sympathy with the awful plight in which we find ourselves. And at times like this, there is no better person to turn to than my old friend, Mr. Douglas Murray. Welcome, Douglas, back to the show.
Very good to be with you, James.
Douglas, I almost wish I weren't talking to you because your presence often means that there has been another hideous atrocity, a terrorist atrocity, as indeed is the case this week. And one of the things I've noticed is that every time there is an incident of this kind, we see the same behaviour patterns that from the politicians, the same behaviour patterns from the commentariat, especially the liberal commentariat, all telling us that this incident has nothing to do with Islam. Does that sound familiar to you, Douglas?
It sure does.
I mean, does it have nothing to do with Islam?
No, it's only got to do with Islam. That's where it starts. That's what it's centered on. People keep on putting excuses into the mouths of the terrorists that they don't ask for, but we keep offering to them anyway. Poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity. It happens everywhere. It happened in America after the Boston Marathon bombers were found. Two young men, two brothers, the Tsarnaevs, who had come to America, had been given everything America could give them, or give anyone, given them scholarships, schooled them, housed them, and then given them scholarships to university, to one of the best universities. And how did the brothers repay the generosity of the American taxpayer and the American nation? By putting bombs at the finish lines of the Boston Marathon. But there are all these people, of course, who then, as now, always try to offer up some excuse that, as I say, the terrorists never themselves ask for. I think, by the way, that since Paris, something has slightly changed. I think there are actually very much fewer people, certainly among politicians than ever before, saying it has nothing to do with Islam. Our Home Secretary in the UK misguidedly yesterday said it had nothing to do with Islam in the House of Commons. But the Prime Minister last night, Prime Minister David Cameron, said that is a big mistake. The Prime Minister actually said for the first time it's wrong to say it has nothing to do with Islam. It obviously does. I feel that I can take some responsibility for that, but lots of other people can as well. But it's a very small and tiny shift in the right direction of understanding the threat that we all face now. I think it's contemptible after the mass murder of European citizens or anyone else that anyone would try to deliberately divert or deflect attention from the problem, because unless we admit what the problem is, unless we see where it comes from, we haven't got a hope of defeating it.
Yeah, I've just been writing up this story about the meme that went round shortly after the atrocities about the security guard at the Stade de France who allegedly foiled the suicide bomb. He was allegedly on the doing door security, and he spotted the guy had a suicide vest on him, and the guy went out and blew himself up in the street. And I'm sure a security officer did indeed foil the plot, but he was not, it turns out, a Muslim guy. That was just a meme that circulated on the internet to make people feel better about themselves, to show that they're not Islamophobic.
Yeah, I have to. It's. I'm glad you picked up on that. It is one of the memes which is always going on. It is very interesting, isn't it? There's always one case that everyone immediately highlights of one Muslim who they can say, this is a good Muslim, this is a person who saved everyone, this is a person who showed the true face of Islam, this is a person who, and so on. I know as well as anyone how many good Muslims there are in the world and how many particularly resent the extremists in their own faith. We know that. We're not kids. We don't need bedtime stories, though. We don't need fables and invented myths handed to us. But the media is always very, very eager to do this, and politicians are very eager to do this. And again, it's just an attempt not to face up to the problems which they've brought on us.
Isn't one of the reasons we so crave these examples of these heroic Muslims is because of the generally disappointing reaction of the Muslim community at times like this, when we yearn for some statements from the various imams, we yearn for a show of solidarity, if you like, with their host nations, to show that really they genuinely do condemn this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. It is another thing we need. I would say that it comes from a very understandable place. I think that most politicians and certainly most journalists in Europe understand what this is. It's very interesting the difference you get between, I'm sure you have this, of speaking to journalists and politicians in private and then reading them and watching them speak in public, how different it is. There is a very, very tight restriction on this debate, mainly imposed, I have to say, by the left, and to the detriment of the entire debate, and indeed, in the end, to the detriment of our security. The fact that the policing of the discussion has been so successful means that politicians are terrified of saying what is going on, and that means that they're not going to be able to tackle it. They're not going to be able to deal with it. It's possible they look at this, they stare into this abyss of problem that they've created in Europe, and think, well, maybe it won't happen in my time. Maybe I'll go before then. I suspect there is a certain element of that. I think these people are contemptible, and hardly needs to be said.
Yeah, I was listening to the BBC Radio 4's Today programme. I think it was yesterday, and the presenter Nick Robinson was at pains to point out that 99.9% of Muslims disapproved of atrocities like this. Well, the figure ain't 9.9%, is it? I mean, there are,
no.
What, 24%, is it? I think expressed sort of vague sympathy with the Charlie Hebdo killings.
Well, yeah, 27% of British Muslims polled by the BBC after the Charlie Hebdo murders said that they understood and had sympathy with the motives, grievances, as it were, of the attackers in Paris. A further 10%, rather interestingly, wouldn't answer the question or said they didn't know. BBC, of course, managed to spin this into a positive story when the poll findings came out by saying majority of British Muslims condemn Charlie Hebdo attackers. And you think, well, that's good. But on all sorts of questions, actually, you haven't really got a majority. You certainly haven't got a majority across most of the world in Muslims polled if you ask them about freedom of expression or freedom of speech. Very far from it. You don't by any means have a majority of Muslims worldwide on your side when you're talking about freedom of conscience or the right to choose a religion or indeed to leave a religion. By no means do you have the majority on your side. In quite a number of countries, you don't have the majority on your side in condemning terrorism. But this all shows how low the bar has gone, and that we're now ecstatic with joy that maybe a mere 10% of Muslims in Europe might, for instance, have sympathy with terrorism.
Which amounts to how many Muslims are there in Europe? So 10% is quite a lot.
It's a very large amount. So in Britain, around 4 million Muslims. That's a mere 400,000 maybe. If you were to pluck the 10% figure, and also I think you'd probably have to go a bit lower than that, quite a bit lower than that, if you were to say actual support for terrorism. It's in the sort of 2 to 3%, I think.
Yeah,
but then sympathy with and so on, and then of course you have all the questions about whether or not they actually want to live under Sharia law or under British law, under European law. You have the same questions in France, similar percentages. The point which I think needs to start to be made is this, and I still haven't got an answer from any politician. if you knew, as now all politicians and mainstream politicians in Europe do, if you knew and had admitted, as all mainstream politicians in Britain and across Europe now have, and I'm talking about politicians from right and left, from Hollande and Sarkozy to Merkel and Cameron and others, if you recognize, as they all do now, that there is a problem of Islamist fundamentalism, and that Islamic fundamentalism, and that it comes from a community, from a faith, and that is a proportion of that faith, however large or small, whether it's 2% or 20% or 10% or whatever it is. If you acknowledge that that is the problem and that this radicalization problem comes from that community, why on earth would you be at the moment bringing millions more Muslims into Europe? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense to increase the pool of people from whom the extremists can recruit. Because we know that aside from the question of the people who are arriving in Europe now by the thousands and thousands every day, the question is not just those arrivals. The question is the pool of potential radicals among a population who, in many cases, their parents and grandparents came to Europe. This is a very big question, and it is one I cannot get an answer to, and I suspect I won't.
We commentators on the supposed right are often accused of being warmongering Islamophobes. I don't know about you, Douglas, but my response to my anger at what happened in Paris is not expressing itself in a desire for immediate military action and for more Mohammed Emwazis to be vaporized by Hellfire missiles. I mean, I suspect that there may be military action one day, and probably it will make us all feel a bit better in a sort of payback time kind of way. But I'm not sure that it'll necessarily achieve anything more than the second Gulf War did. I mean,
Sure.
I've read the history of how it was that ISIS came about, and it's fairly clear that ISIS was created in the post-war period in American-run prisoner of war camps, where al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, was a trustee, one of those prisoners who the Americans allowed to move from camp to camp, apparently because he was good at organizing and dealing with difficult prisoners. Well, of course he was, because he was organizing them, and they were conspiring to form ISIS then. So I don't hold out much hope for military action if and when it appears. Rather, my anger is directed, and tell me whether you feel the same way, towards the liberal appeasers in the West generally, to people who are incapable of understanding why our culture is and its values are worth defending.
Yes, I agree. I think that's the biggest, most important point in a way, isn't it? It's not surprising at all points in human history. Every successful civilization has people who wish to destroy it or defeat it or take over it or anything like that. The strange thing is when people give in, when civilizations give in and decide that they're not up for the fight. I think this is a much more pertinent question, and a very interesting one for one reason in particular, which is the question of what the publics in Europe think as opposed to what our political class think. The American scholar of Islam, Daniel Pipes, sent out a very interesting piece on Saturday night where he said his broad analysis had been confirmed time and again, but I think it's become more pertinent in recent days. And one of his views is that what we see in Europe now with these attacks and so on is that the European publics are moving to the right, inexorably, very clearly, and in very surprising places. Sweden, for instance, the Swedish Democrats, until very recently derided as a far-right, far-outlier party. Now in all the polls, the Sweden Democrats are the top polling party in Sweden. This isn't a coincidence. It's because the Swedish government has overridden the desires of the Swedish people and brought in more and more Muslim immigrants in recent years. But the interesting thing is, as Pipes points out, that at the same time as the publics are moving to the right, the politicians, in response partly to public opinion, are moving further to the left. Now, this creates a very, very troubling dichotomy for Europe and for all of our countries, which is that it means that the politicians are deliberately and willfully walking further and further away from satiating public opinion. And I think that way disaster is going to come because public opinion should be listened to. And the point of democracy is giving vent to and allowing decent representation for people's democratic concerns. So it is those people, the politicians, the people on the left who've been trying to shut this down, who I think have a great reckoning coming to them. And I don't believe that the majority of the European peoples, any more than the majority of the British or American peoples, are actually suicidal. It's a great problem for us that we have suicidal elites. It's a great problem that we have suicidal left-wing medias and politicians. Very well. If they want to kill themselves, they're welcome to do so. They're not taking the rest of us with them.
We're just going to pause for a moment with our sponsor, and we'll be right back to Douglas Murray. Some of the best conversations happen through email. You know the kind. A friend or a colleague reaches out to share a few thoughts. You write back with a few of your own. Before you know it, you've secured a loyal fan, friend or customer, and maybe even some new ideas to share. But very quickly, 10 emails become 100, then 500. It wasn't long before we all had thousands of messages and no time to sift out the conversations worth having. This sounds like me, very much like me. Does this sound like your inbox? If so, this might be your cure. SaneBox does the sifting for you. It diverts the trivial stuff into a separate folder, so all that's left are the emails that matter. With features like one-click unsubscribe and the ability snooze on non-urgent emails, you'll save countless hours and increase your email productivity by 25%. That's more time you can spend engaging your audience. Try it yourself with 2 free weeks of SaneBox. Visit sanebox.com/ricochet to start your trial. No credit card needed. After that, Ricochet listeners get $25 off a membership. That's the deepest discount you'll find anywhere. Again, it's SANEBOX/Ricochet. I was trying to think up some examples of the things that I think need to be done to win the culture wars, or at least to stop this cultural surrender. And one fairly obvious one is I would like to live in a country where if there are gangs of middle-aged Muslim men going round raping underage, with 13-year-old white girls on an industrial scale, then I would like to think that the various authorities, the police, the social services, people in local government generally, responded to that by dealing with the problem and arresting them and putting them in prison and so on, rather than being afraid to blow the whistle for fear of being accused of Islamophobia.
Yes.
Perhaps you can think of some other examples of what might need to be done to arrest this awful cultural decadence.
All sorts of things. I mean, I think you can't do it without stopping or at least very significantly limiting the flow of immigration. I mean, I think it's absolutely the first step. The second step is to be much harsher with those people who very clearly abuse the laws that we have. I think that those people should not have a free ride. I think it's contemptible that the British government tells people what we need to do, but the British government, which is the only institution in the land that can give out, for instance, unemployment benefits, has continued in recent years to give unemployment benefits to people whose sole job full time is to be unemployed and preach jihad. It makes no sense. And any sensible government would obviously not have such a policy, but even a Conservative government in the UK has stumble against what to do in this situation. They stumble against it because people think that somehow there would be public outcry if the wives and children of such hate preachers were on the streets. I don't think there'd be any outcry at all. I don't think anyone would care at all. I think that most people have far more sense than to think that the answer to people who preach the downfall of your society is to support them financially. I don't think anyone really outside, as I say, a very small coterie of left-wing journalists and very loud lobbyists and a few politicians would possibly think that. The rest of us don't. And as I say, I think that in the coming years, by the way, I was a thought provoked by one of your previous comments. I think in the coming years, the left in particular will have a very, very difficult time in Europe, and rightly so. And one of the problems they're going to have is that they've worn down their terms so much that they've become basically useless. What I mean by that is that basically everybody in recent years who tried to warn about these problems was called a racist by the left. Basically everybody who blew the whistle and tried to go off as an early warning siren was derided as an Islamophobe and smeared relentlessly by the left. Well, very well. In the years ahead, maybe there will be racists, maybe there will be actual phobes, but those people on the left will have no language left because I, for one, I think a lot of other people don't believe it anymore. We don't believe that the left mean it when they call racist. We don't believe it that they mean it when they say Islamophobe. We know this is a political project that they've been pushing. It's a political set of ideas that they've been having, and they have been trying to play politics, and they've ended up playing politics with people's lives. And so their favourite tools are going to become useless just at the point when actually they might become needed.
I read a very depressing piece in the Daily Mail today by I think an ex-policeman who said that the British police certainly do not have sufficient high-powered automatic weaponry to deal with incidents of this kind. The French are quite heavily tooled up. They've got semi-automatic weaponry. We haven't. We haven't even got sufficiently high velocity weaponry, I don't think.
I think I'm not sure that. I mean, I think it may not be as prevalent as in France, obviously, but there is the counterterrorism police do have what they need,
right?
And I mean, I think the strangest thing in this regard has been that very strange intervention by the very, very strange man who's currently the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, who asked last night whether he would agree and support a shoot-to-kill policy for terrorists on the streets of London, said that he didn't really want to support such a policy, and that if people with Kalashnikovs ran round as they did in Paris, in the capital city of Great Britain, he would rather, he said, have more community policing solutions. I don't know if you've seen a community policeman ever, James. Most people don't get a glimpse of one ever, but they're sort of rather portly ladies of middle age who sort of wander around the streets with a walkie-talkie on their side. It's fascinating that a senior politician like Jeremy Corbyn can think that if an Islamist fanatic armed with an AK-47 or Kalashnikov rifle rampaged in the streets of London, that a community support officer perhaps could hit him over the head with a walkie-talkie or do a citizen's arrest, or otherwise detain him, maybe give him an ASBO order. It's fascinating that we actually have people in such senior positions at such a serious time who are so fundamentally unserious about our nation.
Yes, I was once admonished by one of those community policemen for running a red light on my bicycle. And he was very good at disciplining me for running a red light, but I don't think he would have been very effective against people wearing suicide vests with endless rounds of ammunition and AKs. I was going to ask you whether it could happen here, but I already know the answer. It's more a question of when, not if, is it not?
Yes, and always was. Yeah. We have a slight advantage in Britain, which is that being an island, which has helped us out in our history before, it is harder to get some of this stuff into the UK than it is to get it into France. That said, it's very surprising what we've discovered people were able to get into France. In Lyon the other day, doing a counter-terrorism raid after the massacres in Paris, a rocket launcher was discovered that ISIS had got in. I have to say, I read reports earlier this year in the press that ISIS were thought to have got rocket launches into France, and I didn't believe it. I thought I couldn't believe they could do that. I didn't think the borders were that bad. But there we go. So, luck and very strange geographical and historical accidents sometimes are what help you.
And what about the US? I do sometimes get the unfortunate impression, I'm sorry, American listeners, but I've been feeling this in the last few days, that Americans aren't really interested in what goes on this side of the pond, except insofar as it affects the political debate in the US. But presumably there will come a time when America too suffers a similar.
Yeah, and of course there have been lots of attempts, and there have been some since the Boston Marathon. There have been some smaller events, but there's a fairly regular tick-tock of thwarted plots in the US, and there will be more. The striking thing to me, again, in the US debate on this is how on earth the United States, the greatest superpower on earth, could possibly have at its leadership a president who will not identify the nature of the enemy, will not have the I word even pass his lips, and a Secretary of State so pathetic that when he said a couple of days ago in the wake of Paris that America would show resolve, nobody cared. Nobody really thought that meant anything. And do you know why? It's something we actually have discussed on this podcast before. Because after the last terrorist atrocity in January in France, in Paris, if you remember, the response of John Kerry, Secretary of State of the most important nation in the world, was to turn up late to Paris, bringing a guitarist and saying, "I've come to Paris to share a hug." Well, in that case, it's not surprising that the leadership of the free world in response to the terrorists of ISIS has been taken by Russia. Not surprising at all, but I do hope that American listeners know that that's where we've ended up.
So 2 quick final questions. First, do you think there will be military action, and what form will it take? Are we going to ultimately have to take all that, take Raqqa, take all that ISIS-held territory?
It's possible. I think it's unlikely that we'll be putting boots on the ground. I think it's more likely we'll be working more with forces in the area. I think
so the Kurds, obviously, but do you think the others as well?
Possibly. I would simply say that I think it's unlikely that anyone is going to be putting down armies. There's a certain amount, a very large amount actually, you can do by air power, but you probably can't do it all by air power. I'm not a great fan of this thing of, in the wake of an atrocity like this, sort of, government sort of chest thumping, which I think is what the British government, among others, is doing. It wouldn't really make any difference, particularly either way, whether the Royal Air Force was engaged in the Syrian side of the border. But there's a sort of sense that everyone wants a piece of it. I don't think that'll answer it.
Supplementary question: Where are you now on the Iranians? Are they our friends in this regard, or are they?
No, of course not. They never were. I mean, it's true that it's been a great skill of Assad and his allies in Iran and indeed in Russia to. It's a very great skill. Obviously, another result of the loss of American leadership in the world. But it's very striking that they've been able to succeed in making this a conflict between Assad and ISIS. That, as it were, at the end of the day, 4 years in, when everyone else is wound down, that basically the world has to support Assad because otherwise it's ISIS. That's what they always wanted. That's the enemy, the reduction, the clarification that they were always after, and they've got it now. But that doesn't make the Iranians our friends. It doesn't make Assad our friend. And I think we still can exercise some discretion in these regards. But also just to remember that this isn't about ISIS. It's not only ISIS. It was Al-Qaeda before ISIS. It'll be something else after ISIS. The problem being the ideology, the I word, the unspeakable word, the thing that shall not be named in the Barack Obama era, that Islamist extremism will will exist as long as we refuse to face up to it. And it will be it'll be something after ISIS, just like it was something before ISIS. The theology of the Iranian revolutionary government in Iran is as vile as that of ISIS, pretty much. The ideology of the House of Saud is as vile as ISIS, pretty much. None of it's very good to choose from. And none of it really is anything we want. Our role, I think, as free peoples in still currently free countries is to defend ourselves and to defend our own way of life and our own values. And if the Islamic civil war that's undoubtedly going on is to tear the Muslim world apart, we have to, as I've said for many years, simply try to make sure that we are as little involved in that civil war at home as we can possibly be.
And my final question is, I've noticed already, as I'd noticed it after all such incidents, that here we are, 4 days afterwards, and already I can sense that these people, all those 129 people, are now fading in the memory as a sort of collateral damage in one of those things that happens. I felt this very much after Charlie Hebdo. What will it take before we have a climate in which people don't start apologizing for this stuff and start actually sticking up for our values?
A heck of a lot more, I'd have thought, very sadly. Very few people are actually influenced by anything other than events. Very few people actually listen to facts and ideas or are influenced by them. And you've got to remember, on 9/11, America lost 3,000 of her citizens in the worst terrorist atrocity in American history and the worst strike since Pearl Harbor. But after that loss, that extraordinary, unprecedented loss, America was not willing even to do, for instance, profiling at airports. Well, that's very interesting, it seems to me. Now, the Israelis do things like profiling at airports because the Israelis have to, because they have a very serious risk and their people have gone through so many bloody wars and disasters. They are serious about it and they have to do certain things. But it was 3,000 people, and American political correctness over the profiling issue still wasn't going to change. You've got to think of it and realize it in those terms. It takes huge numbers of dead bodies for people to drop even tiny bits of political correctness.
And on that very depressing note, Douglas, thank you so much for giving your insights to this show. You were listening to Radio Free Delingpole, broadcasting from a very, very sad and depressing occupied Europe. Thank you and goodbye.